The Rockwell Museum is excited to serve as the venue for the Mormon History Association's program, An American Journey Across the Landscape of Mormon Theology. Opening our doors to organizations such as the Mormon History Association helps the Rockwell fulfill its role as a community resource. The Rockwell is committed to social responsibility, cultural understanding, and global citizenship, and this is reflected through a broad circle of community partners. I'd like to take a minute and introduce the person responsible for initiating this program, Shaylin Barlow. Shay was born in Idaho and moved east at a young age. Although he considers Ithaca home, he maintains a deeply rooted connection with the West. Shay is currently a local resident of Corning and works at Corning Incorporated headquarters when he's not traveling abroad on business. He currently focuses on organizational effectiveness and design, talent acquisition and management, as well as global employee relations for Corning Glass Technologies, Corning Display Technologies, advanced glass innovations, and high-performance displays. Shay studied East Asian Studies and Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. He has lived and worked abroad in China, Taiwan, and India, off and on for over the past 20 years. He speaks fluent Mandarin and enjoys snowboarding, mountain biking, and rock climbing. He and his wife have a daughter and 3 sons. It is my pleasure to welcome Shay Barlow to the podium.
First of all, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I'd like to thank Wilson Ong for being here, as well as Terrell Givens. I was here at the museum, I would say probably last October, attending an event. And I was looking around and I just got so inspired by this space. I looked at much of what is familiar to me by way of geography, and I realized that this museum is a really sacred space. For me, I've experienced that sacred space in many different areas, and I thought to myself, what can I do with this? And it was that moment that I thought of Terrell Givens. In fact, he's been influential on me, and I just casually thought to myself, could I get Terrell Givens here? And it was a very kind of casual experience where I was bored in my office, and I had Terrell's email, and I emailed him, and he responded. So I'd really like to thank Terrell for his willingness to engage with the community, and both him and his wife, Fiona, they just tirelessly travel, and they're always open to new experiences and hearing others' stories. I would just like to take a moment to thank the Rockwell. The Rockwell was very open to my ideas and very instrumental in making all this happen. And I'd also like to thank the Mormon History Association. I think that the Mormon History Association, I'd just like to give a quick overview. They were established in 1965. The Mormon History Association is an independent organization promoting scholarly study of the Mormon past. The past includes the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Community of Christ, and other entities that trace their origins to the founder Joseph Smith. The MHA pursues its mission through annual conferences, a quarterly journal, and free digital newsletter, and awards for outstanding contributions in the field of Mormon history. So part of the question is, why here at the Rockwell? Why discuss Mormon history? And I think it's very interesting. If you know a little bit about Mormon history, what you do know is that Mormon history has always experienced itself on the frontier. Historically, Mormonism lived out its story on the frontier, from Joseph Smith being born in Vermont and extricating his family, extricating him and moving to western New York. And at that time, in the early 1800s, upstate New York was the frontier. I mean, at that time, the canal, the Great Canal had not been built yet. And the Grand Canal had not been built yet. And I would say that if you further trace the movement of Mormonism from New York to Ohio, from Ohio to Missouri to Illinois, and from Illinois into Iowa and Nebraska and across the plains, and into Utah, And even from there, you have this amazing story of many Mormons helping to support America in its westward expansion. I lived for a brief period in San Diego, and there's a museum in San Diego even that focuses on the experience that Mormons and the influence Mormons had in founding and helping to establish that city. So there's many stories I could tell on that forefront, but I think that my story as an individual is very tied into the Mormon story, and I think that history is very sacred to the Mormon people. I would say that why is it that I've had so much passion for Mormon history? Why is it that I've researched it and thought about it so much? And it comes down to my faith's focus on genealogy, because I see it as an experience of understanding my own grandfather, my own great-grandfather, and my own great-great-grandfather, and the generations go back. And I personally am 11 generations Mormon, and so there's a lot of history there. My great-grandfather 11 generations ago is Israel Barlow. And Israel Barlow actually joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Mendon, New York. And it's just outside of Rochester. And as I continue to do more of my own genealogy, just barely 4 years ago, I went to Cornell and I attended a program called ILR, and we joked that it was I Love to Read, because we would be forced by our professors to read 400 to 500 to 600 pages a week. And I was visiting Utah, and I hadn't been back for 11 years. And I went to see my aunt, and I asked her, I said, do you have that book that Grandma used to look at? And she said, I think I can find it. She found it, and quite frankly, no one had looked at this book for years. And that night, I sat down, and I stayed at the table till 3:30 a.m. I read the entire thing. And the next morning, I was the family historian. And at breakfast the next morning, I was telling all sorts of stories about our ancestors, and the extended family was looking at me, how do you know all this? I said, I read the book that's been sitting in the closet all these years. And so for me, my experience is very tied to my genealogy, and I reverence that. So history for us, as we meet on a weekly basis, we meet for 3 hours each Sunday, which can be an extended period of time for some, but we retell our stories over and over again, and our history becomes a form of worship. Just briefly, I would say my grandfather, Carlson, I would never see him doing this until the tail end because I wouldn't wake up this early, but from 4 a.m. until 6 a.m., he would sit at this desk. He was surrounded by books, and he would index every little comment and thought and put it in this massive index filer. It was like, an old-time Google. And that way he could reference it and go back and find what he needed to. And he had hundreds of books. And that influenced me. He would do this before he'd go out to farm potatoes. And so that intensity of study influenced me. I think you heard that I moved from Idaho to New York when I was quite young. In 5th grade, I was sitting in a class here in upstate New York, and we were talking about the migration of the West. I was so excited because I knew a little bit about that. And I told my teacher about the handcart company and how my ancestors crossed the plains with handcarts. And that teacher started laughing at me. And the rest of the class started laughing at me. And my teacher said, that's not possible, that didn't happen. And I remember going back to my father, and so my teacher said, if you can document this and write an essay, a paper about it, I'll give you some extra credit. I did that. In high school, I was very excited about the Book of Mormon, and I wrote a paper about chiasmus and Hebraisms in the Book of Mormon, and my teacher was very excited about these ideas and this concept. When I was at Cornell, briefly, I was manning the Kroc Library, and there's actually an original copy of the Book of Mormon at the Kroc Library at Cornell. And I would go down, I would actually be able to read this one of the original 5,000 prints and put my hands on it. And I felt so much power in that experience that I was able to touch that book because Joseph Smith would have touched that book as well. And so It was at that time that, because I was local to Ithaca, I was manning the Kroc Library. Many of the other students would leave, and I was there, and I was the only employable student to man that library during breaks. And so there's a pretty massive collection of Mormon materials because A.D. White took a trip to Russia, had a chance to meet Leo Tolstoy, and as the mythology goes, Lev Tolstoy asked him about the American religion, and A.D. White had no idea what he was talking about. And so he was a bit humbled and ashamed, came back to Cornell, and he started a very large collection. So I take these stacks of documents and read through them, and it was at that time that I came across Terrell Givens' earliest work, Viper on the Hearth. And he has so many others that I could make mention to. But I would just like to thank Terrell for his discipline, perseverance, and his continued interest in Mormon studies. So, just briefly, this is a book that I inherited from my grandfather, and it's by John Taylor. And John Taylor was, and Terrell will know this, the third or fourth president. Fourth. So he was the fourth president of the church. The third. I was going to say the third, but I was a little hesitant. Nonetheless, I would say some of the gems you can find when you're mining Mormon history. In the 18th century, I found this so telling and so inspirational. Having studied East Asian studies, and you'll have to forgive a little bit of the language. Again, this is the 19th century. So John Taylor wrote, I do not believe that 350 millions of people that live in China in a state of heathen darkness are created to live in this state and be damned because they have not the right religion. I do not believe that all nations that worship various kinds of idols in other different parts of the earth and know nothing about the true God will be consigned to be burned in fire thereafter, because they know no better than worship as they do. I cannot receive any such ideas into my mind, although I was going to say I am not a Universalist, but I am. And I am also a Presbyterian, and a Roman Catholic, and a Methodist. So there's more to this book, but through my studies, I think that I would just like to say, I feel that not only, am I a Mormon, I would say I'm a Taoist, I'm a Buddhist, I'm probably a bit of a heathen, I'm probably an atheist, I would probably say I'm an agnostic, I would say in John Taylor's time, they'd say Mohammedan, but Muslim. There's so much truth in so many places for us to experience and understand. And I think that's the real core teaching for me in Mormonism, is that we can take truth from whence it came and circumscribe it into one great whole. And so I'll just close there. And I would briefly like to introduce Wilson Ong as we want to tie things into the museum. I'm going to read Wilson's bio real quick. Wilson grew up in San Francisco Bay Area and went to Brigham Young University, receiving a BFA in painting and drawing. He furthered his studies in Arts Students League in New York City, New York, studying with nationally renowned figurative artists Ted Seth Jacobs and Harvey Denenstein. He has sold his work professionally as an artist and illustrator since 1983. He has had, sorry, this is a little small, I apologize. He has had exhibits and works shown at the Art Students League, O'Brien's Art Emporium, Scottsdale, Arizona, Springville Museum of Art, Springville, Utah, Butler Institute of American Art, Youngstown, Ohio, Cottage Gallery, Carmel, California, Francesca Anderson Fine Art, Lexington, Massachusetts, Center for Maine Contemporary Art, Camden, Maine, West End Gallery, Corning, New York, to name several. In addition to his professional art, Wilson was a full-time art instructor and dependent chair for 9 years at the Waterford School in Sandy, Utah. His students garnered numerous national and in-state awards during that time. When time allots, Wilson teaches workshops for large to small groups. He presents residence with his family in Corning, New York. He presently resides with his family in Corning, New York, pursuing his art full-time. He has illustrated 4 publications that are currently available on Amazon's website. And moreover, Wilson's a good friend of mine. And I deeply appreciate him. He's an incredible leader, a deeply spiritual person. And I'd just like to ask him to speak a little bit and give us some history about one of the pieces in the museum.
Thank you very much, Shay. And I'd also like to thank the Rockwell Museum. I don't know if everybody has had a chance to look around. I think that's probably the greatest thing about Little Corning here, that it has a wonderful museum like this. Being from the West, there are a number of museums like that over there that have quite a large collection, but being here, to have this kind of quality here in Corning is quite a gift. So thank you very much. One of those gifts are a piece of work that you can find under your chairs. You will see it is Appeal to the Great Spirit. This was created by artist Cyrus E. Dallin. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the piece itself because I would bore you with art talk. So I'm just going to give you a little history. Cyrus E. Dallin was actually born in Springville, Utah. You probably heard mentioned when Shay was talking about my biography that I had things exhibited in the Springville Museum of Art. Well, the Springville Museum of Art was created by 2 pieces of art being donated to that area. One of the pieces was actually the 5th rendition of Paul Revere. It was a plaster sculpture that was finally approved as the final Paul Revere bronze that was created in Boston. That was given to the students of Springville High School. So that piece and another piece by another artist was given with the whole idea that these 2 pieces would eventually start the collection of the Springville Museum. Well, eventually I was able to participate in that. Let me back up a little bit, give you some history about Dallin, Cyrus E. Dallin. His family were converts to the Mormon Church back in England. Actually, his grandparents. They immigrated with their children. I think gets something like 10 children. Of the 10 children, one of them was Jane Hamer, Hamer, and she was about 6 years old at that time. And when they immigrated here, they immigrated and settled in the Utah Valley area. She grew up. She eventually met Cyrus Dallin's father, and they eventually were married. They themselves had 9 children. Cyrus E. Dallin was the second oldest of the children. But sometime when he was young, I suspect when I read it was around 6 years old or something to that effect, something happened to the family as far as the church was concerned. According to the records I read, his father was excommunicated, and as a result of that, none of the family participated in the church at that time. He eventually joined the Presbyterian Church. Eventually, Cyrus E. Dallin would join the Unitarian Church eventually when he moved to Boston. However, because he was from Utah, there was a great deal of influence that he had as far as the culture there, the Western ruggedness there. So as a result of it, much of what he grew up to do was creating things from the West. Many of the sculptures he created, for example, the Appeal to the Great Spirit is actually a series of 4 that he created. That one that you see that the museum has is the last of the series of 4. He is well known for using the terms, maybe it's not politically correct now, creating noble savages. And the 2 are very interesting combinations because we often see During that time, the Native Americans were considered savages because they were not Christians and this and that. Yet at the same time, he could see that they had a definite strength of nobility, and he wanted to draw that out of them as he constructed his sculptures and so forth. He went ahead and studied in Europe. He actually met a person named Augustus Saint Gaudens, and I apologize if I don't pronounce his name correctly. This person is actually very well known as far as doing a great deal of United States Civil War sculptures. If you have ever been to, let's see if I have it listed here, to the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial in Boston, it's quite a phenomenal piece. It's a bas-relief. Anyway, I'll throw that term out. If you don't understand, I apologize. But it's quite a fantastic piece, and they were friends. Augustus was quite a bit older. However, he went there from Springville, Utah. A number of businessmen thought he was very talented, so they said, "We'll gather money, and we will send you to Europe." Well, this was very interesting at that time because as he was sent there, he actually opened the door for future Mormon artists to come. In fact, at that time, there was a Salt Lake Temple that was being completed, and inside needed to be created paintings in the interior. Well, during that time, there was a number of artists, John Hafin, Harwood, Loris Pratt, the son of Orson Pratt, to name 3 of the 5 initial Mormon missionaries that were sent to France to study painting. They had studied painting in Utah, but their teachers said, you need to go to Europe. Well, fortunately, at that time, there was, I forget his name, but another artist who's a painter, and Cyrus E. Dallin, who were there already, made the 5 missionaries who were then going to study art, made their transition much easier. So, Cyrus Dallin at this time, when he went to Europe, was about 19 years old. After he finished his studies, he studied a number of different places afterwards, finally settled in Boston, and again, some of his most famous pieces are, as I mentioned, Appeal to the Great Spirit. The other one was Paul Revere. Paul Revere was something that he did. Now, you may not know that artists do not simply create something and somebody simply buys it. For him and for all artists, we seek commissions. It's a simple way of saying we beg. And, and we beg for work. And so essentially he had created this Paul Revere structure, and he created 5 different plaster sculptures to be approved or not approved. It lasted 40 years before he actually had it cast and had it set in Boston. It was cast in, he finally had it set in Boston, I believe it was 1940, and he actually passed away in 1947. So you can understand his understanding of that. He is also well known because he is the initial creator of the Angel Moroni on the Salt Lake Temple. And this is something that he did not initially want to do. He was not LDS at that time, but his mother, who had still lived in Springville, and they are buried there with his father, compelled him to do it. And he says, "Well, I do not believe in angels." And he said, "Well, look at me. Am I not your angel mother?" And then he decided that he would do that. In fact, he is quoted as saying that after he completed the project, that he had not felt closer to God than after he had completed that one sculpture. But he also did other things too. For those who are familiar with Salt Lake City, he did the Brigham Young. This is the place monument on the crossroad. It's no longer there. At the crossroads, they've moved it. But if you've ever been in downtown Salt Lake, that is a sculpture that he has done. He has also done a number of things in the rest of the world. But the 2 major things that he's most well known for is his sculpture of the Appeal to the Great Spirit. And if you don't know this already, it's made out of bronze. So depending on the licensing, it can be created a number of different times. And therefore, much like modern day art prints, that piece of artwork can be seen in many different places and so forth. But the Rockwell Museum actually has one of, I believe, 5 or 9 original plasters of the Appeal to the Great Spirit. So this is actually a unique place. Springville actually has one of those. But it is a unique piece, and it is really quite indicative of his work, creating all sculptures, regardless of what the genre was, of nobility, of dignity, and of spiritual worth. And so I really have enjoyed him ever since I lived in Utah, and so I pay homage to him at this point, and thank you very much, and turn the time back to Shay.
Thank you very much, Wilson. So what I'd like to do is quickly introduce Terrell Givens. Terrell did graduate work in intellectual history at Cornell and in comparative literature at UNC Chapel Hill, where he received his Ph.D. He holds the James A. Bostwick Chair of English and is professor of literature and religion at the University of Richmond, where he teaches courses in 19th century studies and the Bible's influence on Western literature. His writing has been praised by the New York Times as provocative reading, and his numerous books include When Souls Had Wings, a history of the idea of premortal life in Western thought, by the Hand of Mormon, the ancient scripture that launched a world religion. And with his wife, Fiona Givens, who is also here, The God Who Weeps, How Mormonism Makes Sense of Life. His most recent book is Wrestling the Angel, The Foundations of Mormon Thought. He lives in Montpelier, Virginia. And with that, we'd like to welcome you, Terrell.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction. Thank you for the warm welcome that we've received here in the place both of some graduate work that I did, but also the place of my birth many years ago, nearby Cortland. Well, I'm here to talk this evening about Mormonism. And Mormonism has exploded onto the academic scene in the last 10 to 15 years. There are now chairs in Mormon studies at the University of Virginia, at the University of Claremont Graduate School, at Durham University in England, at the University of Utah. There are discussions about having chairs in Mormon studies at a number of other major American universities. And one of the questions that some people are asking is why? Why this sudden interest in Mormonism on the part of academics? Excuse me. And one reason, I think, has to do with the fact that one of the premier sociologists of religion in America, Rodney Stark, pointed out in a 1984 study that if Mormonism's growth rate continues unabated into the new century, that Mormonism will soon be the first new world religion since Muhammad rode out of the desert 600 AD. So sociologists of religion feel that here is the first opportunity that they have had in the modern world to actually watch a religion, a world religion, in process of formation. So that explains some of the academic interest on the subject. I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the origins of Mormonism in this area of upstate New York. And I'm going to talk about a theme that is common to virtually all new religious traditions, and that is the theme of suspense. And I put that slide up on the screen so that you would be held in suspense until this moment, wondering, what does that have to do with anything? Most scholars of the Protestant Reformation recognize that virtually every breakaway from the Catholic Church was motivated by a personal feeling of religious anxiety on the part of the founder. And what I have put on that slide there is just an excerpt from an 18th century reader that was commonly used in elementary schools in Great Britain in the 19th century. It just captures what was a quasi-universal experience of all religiously inclined people of that age, which was terror and fear and uncertainty and anxiety about their spiritual state and standing. So the first thing that we need to understand is that, as I said, this is a catalyst behind many, many new religious formations. And, in fact, we find that in the case of Martin Luther himself, he tells us in his own writings that this was what led him to his initial break with Roman Catholicism. My situation was that though an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner, troubled in conscience, and I had no assurance. No assurance. So his initial quest was to find some mechanism, some religious understanding that would give him peace of mind. If we look at the founder of one of the most thriving, successful religious movements of the 19th century, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, you can see that he had a similar kind of anxiety, and like Luther, he felt that he found a similar solution that he expressed as a personal assurance that he had found salvation. Now, if we jump ahead another 100 years, we come to the young boy, Joseph Smith. And he describes his initial encounter with deity as a similar quest for spiritual assurance precipitated by an anxiety over his salvation. And the consequence of his first such foray into the woods in search of spiritual assurance was what Mormons have referred to ever since as the first vision, in which he claimed that he was visited by God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ. But what most Mormons fail to recognize is that the first words spoken him, according to his earliest 1832 account of this visitation, was, "Joseph, your sins are forgiven you." So Mormons tend to see this by and large as an event that precipitated the restoration, the creation of the church. In Joseph Smith's own mind and experience, it was entirely a personal experience in which he received an intimate, personal witness that his spiritual state and standing were going to be okay. So Joseph is in this time in Palmyra, New York. I love this photograph because it captures, to my mind, one of the great paradoxes of Joseph Smith's life. This picture I actually took in the center of Palmyra, the main intersection, where you find 4 different churches representing 4 different denominations, but they weren't enough for Joseph Smith. He felt that he had to go outside the available options, which is exactly where he went. This is a photograph of the Smith farm. And let me say a word about this photograph. This is a treasure. I just came across this in a rare bookshop in Port Townsend, Washington. And this comes from a 1954 Department of Agriculture publication. As late as the 1950s, the United States government was still publishing booklets on how to use divining rods to locate water. And as one of the illustrations in this 1954 publication, they go back to the 16th century, and this is a German woodcut from the 16th century. Now, here's the reason why I find this such an incredible discovery, at least to me. We have long known as historians of Mormonism that upstate New York was rife with what we call folk religion. People used divining rods and seer stones and other means of scrying, methods that to them were perfectly compatible with religious experience as they understood it, but to the modern person seem a little bit bizarre or strange. In particular, the link seems curious between divining rods, which are mentioned in connection with Oliver Cowdery, who was Joseph Smith's scribe, and searching for buried treasure, which we know Joseph participated in. But it's only in this photograph that I've seen the two historically linked, divining rods in order to search for buried treasure. Now, let me share with you, and that in fact is a silver mine where Joseph Smith was employed near Harmony, Pennsylvania, in the search for buried treasure. This is a photograph that I also took just a few miles, I think a few miles from here. How far is Cortland from here?
About an hour and a half.
Okay, about an hour and a half. Okay, so this is the farm where I was born. And this is my father, and he was born on that farmland. And he was not a Latter-day Saint, he was a Methodist. And as a young boy growing up on this farm, he noticed that there were all of these depressions in the fields. Every now and then you'd encounter what apparently had been massive holes that had been filled in and then sunk with time. And he remembers as a young boy, so this would have been like back in the 1930s, he remembers asking his father, "What are all of these holes on the farmland?" And his father said, "Oh, those are windshield holes." Winchell holes. They're just Winchell holes. Winchell, Winchell holes. My father's a young boy. He doesn't give it a second thought. He never gave it a second thought for about 60 years. And then one day, my father wrote books on Mormon history, as I do. He was doing research into Oliver Cowdery, who was, as I said, Joseph Smith's scribe for the Book of Mormon. And it turns out that Oliver Cowdery's father, who was named William Cowdery, was a money digger, and he was friends with a man named Samuel Winchell. And Samuel Winchell passed through this area of upstate New York, digging for buried treasure, using divining rods. And so these holes on the farm in the area of Cortland were dug by Samuel Winchell and his associates, probably back in the 1820s. And all that was left by way of memory was that they had some association with this name Winchell, okay? So this is to say something of the richness of this environment out of which Joseph Smith himself comes, being born in Palmyra and being himself familiar with the use of scrying stones, or seer stones, as they were called. Now, that's one way of talking about the origin of the Book of Mormon, and that would be a kind of cultural, history-informed way of talking about the Book of Mormon, the kinds of practices, religious practices and expectations, traditions that were in place that give us one way of thinking about what led him then to make the claim that he had, in fact, found buried treasure. In this case, a buried set of gold plates, which, according to his story, were delivered to him by the Angel Moroni. But that gives you a way to think about the Book of Mormon as something that came directly out of this rich cultural setting here in upstate New York. Now, one of the questions that I want to try to answer tonight is, how do we explain the fact that if you pick any book, take any book that's an almanac of religion published in the 1830s, 40s, or 50s, and you will find in the table of contents sometimes as many as 100 different religious denominations that today no longer exist. They were so prevalent that in 1838, one man named Reese wrote a book called Humbugs of New York, because he thought New York was especially rife with this phenomenon. Everybody was starting their own church. And so the question is, why did Mormonism survive when dozens and dozens of others perished by the way? So that's one of the questions that I want to answer tonight. And I'm going to answer it by taking us back to the initial slides that refer to religious anxiety. And let me tell you how Mormonism reacts specifically to that particular religious dilemma. And I'm going to skip through these just for economy's sake. If you were to go into a bookstore in the 17th century, or the 18th century, or the early 19th century, and look in the religious section, you would find that most of the books had the word covenant in the title. I just pulled these down from the internet in just a few minutes. This is just a random sampling of some religious titles from the 1617 and early 1800s. Everybody with any religious experience at all in the early 1800s was immersed in the language of covenant. Because the way Martin Luther solved his problem of anxiety was to develop what would later be called covenant theology. The Puritans were the ones who really picked up the ball and ran with it. But here's how the idea works. Catholicism traditionally is understood as a religion which is based on two prerequisites. You have to have the proper sacraments performed by somebody who has the authority to perform them. And then you have to comport yourself in such a way that you honor those sacraments. And then your salvation is not assured, because there is no Catholic doctrine of assurance. But it's as close as you can come. And Martin Luther was effectively saying, that's not good enough. Right? That's not good enough. Because I spend all day, every day repenting. And as soon as I leave the confession, I've committed another sin in my mind. And then I have to go back and confess again. And I can't even make it back to my cell. So he reads Paul, and he determines on a theology that today we refer to as the doctrine of salvation by grace. And here's how he understands that. He says, my faith in myself is never going to be sufficient or adequate to give me any kind of assurance because I'm a fallible, sinful man. But Christ is perfect. and perfectly reliable. And if he has promised me salvation through his sin, then my confidence is in that promise, that covenant. And so the certainty that you feel has nothing to do with your personal state of mind or qualifications. It is a certainty based on Christ's promise. And for the Puritans, that becomes the basis of what they call covenant theology. So virtually all Protestants, especially in the American tradition, have some variety of covenant theology at the heart of their religious understanding. And that's why all of the books are rife with this language, because the Presbyterians may understand it a little bit differently than the Methodists, than the Baptists, but they all come back to this essential foundation that Adam was given a covenant in the Garden of Eden. It was the covenant of works. He violated the covenant and damned the whole human race. Christ comes and institutes the covenant of grace, the new covenant, the everlasting covenant, and now we are saved not through works but saved by grace. That's what everybody understands. Now in 1830, the Book of Mormon comes off the press, and what does it say on the very title page? You can all read that, right? Okay, how would we try this one? So it's an abridgment taken from the people of Nephi, and we learn about them if we read the Book of Mormon, to come forth by the gift and power of God, etc., etc. But what is the purpose of the Book of Mormon? To show unto the remnant of the house of Israel what great things the Lord has done for their fathers, that they may know the covenants of the Lord. The word covenant appears in the Book of Mormon 174 times. It's an average of once every couple of pages. So people reading the Book of Mormon for the first time would immediately hear the resonance of this word covenant. It would sound familiar, but then they would be intrigued because the presentation of the covenant that comes through the Book of Mormon is something unlike any covenant theology that the Protestants had yet devised. And so that's what we'll do for the rest of my remarks, is we will talk about the ways in which Mormon covenant theology is different. And it's different in at least two fundamental categories that I'll review. One is that the covenant theology, instead of being predicated on what I would call more or less a static paradigm fixed in time, demarcated by the time between the fall of Adam and the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ, instead it predicates a dynamic cosmology that is temporally infinite in both directions. And two manifestations of this are what we can call the ruptured canon. I like that word better than the open canon. And that comes largely from my wife Fiona's very perceptive reading of what Joseph Smith had to say about an open canon. And then the cosmos itself is something that's evolving. And this is a radically new idea in the 18th century that Joseph picks up on and incorporates into his theology. And then what I call eternal relationality. In other words, Joseph Smith, beginning with the Book of Mormon, but then elaborated much more thoroughly in his own theology, his own revelations, radically alters the nature of the relationship between man and God as it had been described in Protestant covenant theology. So let's see if we can see a few examples of how this takes place. Okay. This book, called The Apocryphal New Testament, was published in 1820 by William Hone. William Hone was an Englishman. He was put on trial 3 times for blasphemy because he wrote caricatures, satires, pillaring the church, the established Church of England. So he's put on trial 3 times. He ends up repenting, feeling that he had been very irreverent, regretted what he had done. But he said, much more pernicious than any of my satires on religion was the fact that I published this book in 1820. The Apocryphal New Testament. What it is it's a collection of ancient writings that today we would call pseudepigraphal or apocryphal writings. The writings that were attributed to the apostles in many cases. The Gospel of Nicodemus, for example, the Gospel of Peter, the infancy Gospels of Jesus. but they were ones that got excluded from the canon. And so William Hone collects them and he publishes them as an apocryphal New Testament. Now, why would that be considered a blasphemous treachery against the church, which he himself acknowledged? He says it was pernicious. Well, because he said it opened up the question of what is revelation and how reliable is revelation and what does it mean to have a canon? Because if there were all of these other writings by apostles and other church authorities, then it makes it sound like our canon might have turned out differently if different men had been making the selection. And that's a terrifying idea, because Christians wanted to believe that the Bible was always given. It came from God, right? Letter and word perfect the first time, according to his divine intention and will. Well, guess what book Joseph Smith had in his personal possession? William Hone's apocryphal New Testament. And we can read in Joseph Smith's own history of the church that he says there was a day in 1830 when he said he and the elders were all talking about all of these books of the Bible that were mentioned in the Bible but no longer were a part of the Bible. And one of them, Joseph Smith said, was the Book of Enoch. In other words, what happens is that Joseph Smith took the implications of the apocryphal New Testament and ran with it in exactly the way that William Hone was afraid. Joseph Smith inferred that, well, then maybe there were many inspired things that God said that never made it into the final collection. And so then Joseph starts to produce, in addition to the Book of Mormon, the writings of Moses, the writings of Abraham, additional modern revelations. And this is what I mean about a ruptured canon. So suddenly, we're in a destabilized world where things are no longer cut and dried as certain as they used to be in the old paradigm of how covenant relationship works. God has the plan, it's unalterable, the whole roadmap is there in between the two covers of the Bible. And suddenly Joseph is saying, well, there may be lots more out there that we haven't assimilated yet. This is just an interesting example of somebody else who apparently was on the same wavelength as William Hone. Walter Scott was one of the great restorationists, and he captures the spirit of that particular moment in time, the early 19th century, when he, like any other number of individuals, were going in the same direction William Hone was and saying, well, maybe if these are indeed the last days, we will see some evidence of this by way of a new revelation or a new Bible. Okay. I also said that he radically reformulates the cosmos and turns it into what I call a dynamic cosmos. And let me, if you'll permit me, I want to read just a page or two from my book on Mormon theology. In 1789, okay, so we're just a few decades before Joseph Smith. In 1789, as revolutionaries in France were reshaping the political order, the leading astronomer of the age, William Herschel, was shifting the cosmic paradigm. He published a paper called On the Construction of the Heavens in 1785, and it affected a change in the Western world's cosmic vision that I think was more dramatic and had greater impact than Copernicus's revolution of the Ptolemaic system. For generations of thinkers, God's supreme perfections had suggested that the universe he created must likewise be flawless and complete when he laid down his celestial instruments. When he pronounced his labors good and rested from his efforts, the perfectly ordered cosmos had nothing to do but hum along in sublime harmony until the end of time. Right, kind of the clockmaker deistic version of the universe. The great chain of being was the expression that people had used from Aristotle all the way through Alexander Pope in the 18th century. The universe is static, it's perfect, because if it changes, that means that God didn't get it right the first time. So it has to be the same. What did William Herschel do? Well, he invented telescopes of unprecedented size and power. And his astronomical observations only confirmed the infinitude of God's domain, revealing star systems beyond star systems in unending procession. But Herschel quickly perceived that he was observing a universe in the process of continual disruption, upheaval, and transformation on a colossal scale. He described extensive combinations, stars in process of condensation, others in retreat or in collision. Quote, when at the same time that a cluster of stars is forming in one part of space, there may be another collecting in a different, but perhaps not far distant quarter, which may occasion a mutual approach towards their common center of gravity. As a natural consequence of the former cases, there will be formed great cavities or vacancies by the retreat of stars toward the various centers which attract them. The whole was a scene of such violent contestation that he admitted surprise that the entirety did not tend to a general destruction of the universe by the shock of one star's falling upon another. Indeed, as one writer has summarized the import of Herschel's discovery, he completely overturned any residual idea of a stable, overarching, temple-like universe created once and for all by the great celestial architect, and replaced it with a dynamic cosmos of waxing and waning worlds, fluid movements, and changes. Didn't that get you excited? That's the universe we inhabit. And it wasn't until the era of Joseph Smith's birth that we had empirical grounds for understanding that the universe is in a process of continual dynamic flux and fluidity. And so I would make the argument that maybe the best way, the richest way of understanding Joseph Smith's thought and theology is of him taking that new cosmic paradigm and reconciling it with his vision of God, of humans, of our relationship, of our origin, and our potential. So what does this mean in more specific terms? Well, the covenant relationship of Protestantism was predicated on Christ's atonement, at which moment on the cross grace is said to enter into the universe. Joseph Smith pushes that story back in time, hundreds, thousands, millions of years. In his King Follett Discourse, he said, this is how it all began. God found himself in the midst of spirits and glory, and because he was greater, he saw proper to institute laws whereby the rest who were less in intelligence could have a privilege to advance like himself and be exalted with him. Okay, any definition of theology that you look up in the 19th century will say theology is concerned with the interaction between God and man in the time that spans the fall of Adam and the resurrection of Christ. And Joseph Smith takes that definition and just explodes it in both directions and says, no, grace erupts into the universe at a moment in a primordial past when eternally existent beings are invited into a dynamic relationship with him. That's a different way of thinking about covenant and covenant relationships. So, that says something very different about God, and it says something very different about the human. Now, all Protestant churches in America, virtually all Protestant churches, based their theology on the 39 Articles of the Church of England, which was one of the very first Protestant creeds. It was later modified into the Westminster Confession. And the first article of faith in the Westminster Confession is, we believe in a God without body, parts, or passions. Now let me say a little bit about what this means. Without body or parts, clear enough, but what does it mean to believe in a God without passions? The doctrine of an impassible God goes back into the Middle Ages, and it's the belief that God cannot be moved by anything analogous to human emotion. And here's the argument. Well, think about it, right? When we talk about emotions, we always talk about them as a change of state, right? You get jealous. You become angry. You turn sad. But God, being perfect, can't change. Because, the classical philosophers argued, if he changes, he could only change for the better or the worse. And if he changed for the worse, he wasn't perfect to begin with. He would now not be perfect, and if he changed for the better, then he wouldn't be perfect to begin with. So God cannot be moved and experience a different emotional state. But in the new cosmological universe of Joseph Smith, God the Father himself experiences pain, suffering, joy, delight, and the entire spectrum of what we associate with as human emotions. And this teaching comes most powerfully in a document he produced called The Prophecy of Enoch, which emerged out of his work revising the Bible in the fall and winter of 1830. This is the most important passage from that work, comes from what we now would find in the book of Moses in the Pearl of Great Price. And I'll let you read that for yourself. But what's so remarkable about it is that in this story, the prophet Enoch ascends to heaven. It's an old-style ascension narrative. He has a dialogue with God the Father, and 3 times he asks God, "Why are you weeping? Why are you weeping?" And then God answers him and says, "Well, it's because of the misery of my children." So in that one moment, Joseph Smith definitively breaks with the entirety of the Christian creedal tradition, which affirms the impassibility of God. That's the theological term. Impassible means incapable of being moved by emotion. Okay? So we get a passible deity. Now I said you go back to the Middle Ages to get the impassible deity. But if you go all the way back to Origen, who was a 2nd century Christian, the first to write a theology of Christianity, he believed in a passible deity. I'm going to come back to him at the very end of my lecture. So keep his name in mind. As I said, Origen wrote the very, very first theology. It's called On First Principles, sometime at the end of the 2nd or early 3rd century. And he said, well, of course God the Father feels pain. Nietzsche isn't somebody that one would usually invoke for support of a religious idea, but Nietzsche himself said, "Even God hath his hell. It is his love for man." And so what he meant was any God or being who places trust or invests himself in a relationship makes himself vulnerable and will experience the pain of disappointment. Now, not only is God radically reconceptualized in this new scheme, but humans are radically reconceptualized as well. Because if you remember that quotation from the King Follett Discourse I cited, God finds himself in the midst of these other eternal spirits, which means the human spirit in Mormon's cosmology is uncreated. So this leads to what Mormons call the doctrine of the pre-existence. And the pre-existence is an idea that has never been embraced since the 6th century officially by any Christian church. But if you were to study the history of pre-existence, you would find that it is an idea that appears in the oldest religious text in existence, 2000 BC, Atrahasis clay tablets describing Babylonian creation myths. And it's been promulgated as recently as by the great American poet Robert Frost, and almost everybody in between. So there's a rich, rich history of asserting that humans have lived eternally with God in a spirit state or condition. But it was considered a heresy. It was anathematized by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century for a very interesting set of reasons, which we can go into later if you want. Thirdly, in addition to positing the eternal pre-existence of the human spirit, Joseph Smith claims that relationships themselves can be eternal. So some theologians would say what Joseph Smith is doing here is he's reconfiguring heaven from a theocentric realm to an anthropocentric realm. I think that's an overstatement, but I would phrase it this way. The covenant in Puritan theology is a unidimensional vertical relationship. God reaches down in grace, man reaches up in faith. In Joseph Smith's cosmology, it is vertical and it is horizontal. We have a relationship with God that he invited humankind to enter into in the premortal worlds. We can have the possibility of eternal relationships, or what Joseph Smith called an eternal sociality with friends, peers, and loved ones. Truman Madsen was a Mormon philosopher, and I thought he captured very nicely this idea. Now, the monument underneath that quotation is one that my wife and I have visited actually every time that we find ourselves in York Minster in York. And I'm terribly moved every time I pass by this monument, because it was installed by a man named Phineas Hodson, who lost his beloved wife and had this monument erected to her memory. And the words that always stand out in my mind are that he did this in the hope, quote, to be reunited with her in bliss, who now hears not when I call. So almost anybody who's been in love has experienced the hope and the aspiration of some eternal association or relationship. But Joseph Smith was the first to explicitly make that an article of faith in the religion that he organized. So let me, at this point, see if I can flesh out a little more fully how Joseph Smith understood what I call this Mormon theology of covenant. I think there are three moments in the life of Joseph Smith that were really seminal for understanding Mormon theology. And those three moments were in 1823, in 1836, and in 1844. In 1823, Joseph Smith is in his room in his home in upstate New York, and according to his record, he is once again perplexed and troubled by an uneasy conscience, anxious about his spiritual state and standing before God, and so he embarks one more time upon personal prayer. And he said that this time September 22nd of 1823, an angel appeared to me by the name of Moroni. And it was on this occasion that Moroni first revealed to Joseph Smith the story of the Book of Mormon. So I don't think it's a coincidence, although we tend to separate these events, that the Book of Mormon, Joseph claims, is revealed to him in response to an anxiety about salvation. So that's the first event. And that evening, he says, the angel repeated to him words from the last verses of the Old Testament. I will send you Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers. Now, imagine you're this young 17-year-old kid. You're a little uneasy about your spiritual state and condition. You think an angel is appearing to you, and he quotes Malachi. What do you make of that? Probably nothing at all. And neither did Joseph, as far as we can tell. He didn't know what to make of that. Then, 13 years later, 1836, Joseph believes that he has been commanded by God to build a temple. The temple of Kirtland, Ohio is at last completed. It's dedicated in April. And then Joseph claims that on the occasion shortly after the dedication that he is visited by a heavenly being who identifies himself as Elijah. Now Joseph would remember, oh, Elijah. Yeah, Moroni, yeah, that angel. He said something about Elijah back in 1823. Does Joseph have any idea what this means, what the significance in his own mind is of this visit of Elijah to him? Probably not. But by 1843, he's convinced in his own mind that he's able to finally make sense of this. And he understands that the promise that the children will somehow be connected with the parents, and the parents will be connected with the children. Maybe that's at the heart of the covenant theology that he has been called as a prophet to reinstitute. And so he gradually finds himself instituting sacraments or ordinances in the temple at Nauvoo that effect this binding of the dead to the living. And in January of 1844, which I take as kind of the culmination of Joseph Smith's prophetic religion making, he says this to a large assembly of perhaps thousands gathered in the Grove in Nauvoo, Illinois. His King Follett discourse, much more famous. I think this discourse much more important. He says, And you may want to keep in mind that as he's saying this, his death is just a matter of weeks away. The Bible says, "I will send you Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, that he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." But what is the object of this important mission? How is it to be fulfilled? The keys are to be delivered. The spirit of Elijah is to come. The gospel to be established, the saints of God gathered, Zion built up. The saints to come up as saviors on Mount Zion. But how are they to become saviors on Mount Zion? By building their temples, erecting their baptismal fonts, going forth and receiving all the ordinances, baptisms, confirmations, washings, anointings, and ordinations, and sealing powers upon our heads in behalf of all our progenitors who are dead, and redeem them, that they may come forth in the first resurrection and be exalted to thrones of glory with us. And herein is the chain that binds the fathers to the children. If we go back to Protestant covenant theology, who are the saved according to the Puritans? Those who were influenced by John Calvin especially said a very, very small select group of people, preordained, foreordained, predestined by God to be the inheritors of his salvation. And Joseph Smith reconfigures that limited covenant into an infinitely expansive covenant by saying any true everlasting covenant has to be generous enough to encompass the entirety of the human family, living and dead. And that explains why Joseph saw his most important work as a religious reformer to be the inauguration of temples, after the model of Old Testament temples, but established for the particular purpose of performing those saving sacraments for the human family that had already passed beyond the veil. So I think the Book of Mormon initiated Joseph Smith into thinking about covenant theology. I think it laid the groundwork for his thinking in this regard that was later supplemented and amplified by a whole series of what he claimed were angelic visitations and revelations from on high. But this, to my mind, represents the culmination and the fullest fruit of his vision. Let me just say, by way of conclusion, that one of the questions that most perplexes scholars of religion today is, how do you classify Mormons? Sidney Alstrom wrote the most used and respected history of religion in America, and he ends his discussion of Mormonism by saying, nobody really knows. Is this a sect? Is it a cult? Is it a tradition? Is it a new faith? We don't know. But when the question is asked, are Mormons Christian? One way to answer that question would be to say, well, what is your historical understanding of Christian? And this is a statement, I love this statement, because it's by a secular academic. She's a scholar of ancient religious patristics. And this is what she says, not about Mormonism. She just says this about the two most influential early Christian thinkers who were later anathematized, cursed, excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Origen and Pelagius. Origen, as I said, late 2nd, early 3rd century. Pelagius, a little bit later, he's a contemporary of St. Augustine. The twin condemnation of Pelagius and Origen ensured the supremacy in the Christian tradition of a theology whose central concerns were human sinfulness, not human potentiality. Divine determination, not human freedom and responsibility. So what this means is one way of understanding Mormonism in the context of Christian faiths is as that church that took the other road and said, no, we're going to stay with Pelagius and Origen, when the rest of the Christian tradition follows Augustine and the Reformers and etc. So are Mormons Christian? Well, clearly, historically speaking, they are, if you are comparing them to the earliest Christian fathers and their thoughts and teachings. Clearly not if you're defining Christianity in terms of the creeds that are elaborated in the Middle Ages and later. Thank you very much.
So if you guys are interested, we're going to stick around for a few more minutes. I'm going to ask some questions of Terrell. And if you have some questions of your own, there's cards underneath you. You can pass them up to my wife, who's in the front row with the curly hair, beautiful curly hair. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm sure that a few questions could come through and we can field those. And in the next few minutes, Terrell and I will just sit up front, and I'll pepper him with a few good questions. I wanted to get some water for him as well. Terrell, thank you very much for the lecture. I think that was the first time I'd ever seen that photograph of Joseph Smith. It was incredible. I'd never seen that before. So maybe you could just speak to that for a moment and the history of that, where you found it.
That is a photograph that was discovered by the Community of Christ, once known as the Reorganized Church. It's not been verified or authenticated, but how do you do that? How do you go about authentication? A number of people have done studies in which they overlay different portraits of Joseph Smith and even the death mask, and it seems to be entirely consistent with the physiognomy of Joseph Smith. And so there's every reason to believe that it is the only actual photograph that exists. The other closest thing that we have is that famous painting where he's, the pompadour kind of thing, which is a painting from a photograph. But this would be the first actual photograph. So can't affirm for sure that it's his, but a good likelihood.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to know a little bit more about your connection to upstate New York, and do you think this has influenced your study of Mormon history?
No, it hasn't influenced my connection to Mormon history because, excuse me, I was unaware of any correlation between Mormonism and upstate New York until my adult life and until other scholarly interests just happened to take me in the direction of Mormon studies. I can say just a word about how I did get into the field. I specialize in 19th century literature. My father specialized in collecting anti-Mormon books. And he himself was not anti-Mormon. He was just curious. He was a book collector, and he ran a used bookshop, and he kept coming upon all of these. I mean, did you know, for example, that the first Sherlock Holmes mystery was an anti-Mormon novel, Study in Scarlet? Two of the best-selling Zane Grey Westerns were anti-Mormon novels. Jules Verne, Mark Twain, Artemis. I mean, everybody that's writing in the 19th century is picking on the Mormons. And so he handed me a pile of this stuff. I remember it was 3 issues of Harper's Weekly with a series called Two Mormons from Muddlety. And it was a hilarious comic, but horribly insulting, deprecating account of Mormonism. And he said, you're a professor of literature, do something with this stuff. And so the more I read it, the more I thought, yeah, there are some very interesting patterns of representation that are common to all of these representations. And I could have a ball just spending the rest of the evening talking about these patterns because they were really so intriguing, but I'll just briefly suggest a couple of things. One of them was that the Mormons were always Orientalized. The Mormons are always depicted as coming from the Orient, looking foreign. They're not white. In fact, in one famous story, somebody says something about, they're not white, they're Mormons. So they're radically differentiated. In illustrations in the 19th century, they dress either like the Amish, they speak a different dialect. Sometimes they wear funny robes. In one illustration I can think of, they look like Italian terrorists. But it was so universal. It was like, why? Why would they be representing them this way? And then the other pattern that I noticed was that in every single account of Mormonism in 19th century fiction, converts are made either by hypnotism or by coercion. And so if you put all of those things together, here's what you come up with. Did you know where the term brainwashing comes from? We don't know for sure, but there's good evidence that it was a term first used by a CIA analyst, and it was used in a campaign of disinformation during the Korean War. Because if you're a mother or a father from Panguitch, Utah, and you've just sent your boy to bleed and die in the fields of Korea, and the next thing you know, he's defected to the Korean side, how are you going to handle that? How will you maintain a strong sense of, no, me and my values and our country, and this, no, that couldn't have happened. And so if you say, well, he was brainwashed, right, then it wasn't his choice. And so it allows you to preserve intact your image of him and your image of yourself. Something similar, I think, was happening in the 19th century. Mormonism was so far outside the norm, nobody wanted to acknowledge or believe that you would willingly join. So if they're kidnapped, they're coerced, they're mesmerized, they're hypnotized, oh, well, that would explain it, so I don't have to worry. My identity is not at stake. Now, how do you explain the Orientalization and all of that? Well, why is it that heretics are always burned at the stake, but infidels aren't? The Inquisition didn't burn Muslims. It didn't burn Jews. It burned heretics. Because you're always more threatened by somebody who is kind of just like you, but a little bit different. Those are the dangerous ones, right? Because they can slip in through the portals. Or as Cosmopolitan magazine in 1911 said, Mormons are the viper on the hearth. They're the snakes that insinuate themselves into the family home and then spring and get you, right? So, if we can say, no, they look different, they speak different, they act different, they clothe themselves differently, and it gives you a kind of psychic, safe distance. And you can assure yourselves that the threat, the anxiety of seduction isn't as pronounced. So that was how I came up with my first book.
So if you could tell us about a significant life experience or defining moment in your own personal history, that might tell us a little bit more about who you are.
Let's go on to the next one.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So I'll let you think about that one a little bit. And the next one I think might be a little easier, a softball for you. What is it about Mormon history that is so fascinating to you?
Well, there are a couple of things about Mormon history, and more particularly Mormon theology. And this is, I think, what I am struck by is the essential stability of the framework that Joseph Smith inaugurated in 1830. All of the elements are there in 1830. Between the Book of Moses and the Book of Mormon, you have human preexistence, you have the passible deity, you have life as an ascent, not a fall, you have the possibility of universal salvation, you have the idea of families being paramount. Whereas most religious traditions tend to evolve and change doctrine frequently. I'll give you an example. I was having a conversation with a Methodist theologian at a conference. We were supposed to be modeling how to talk about religious differences. And we did a pretty good job. And at one point he said, oh, you Mormons, you think you invented this passible deity. He said, we Methodists were teaching a passible deity in the 1800s, a God who weeps and loves and feels. And I said, are you familiar with the creeds of the Methodist faith? And he thought of it and he goes, well, we don't really pay attention to those. And it's like, well, you can't just move the goalpost. Come on. So I guess that's what intrigues is this guy. He's a farm boy from frontier New York, 1830, and he's got this system in place that is just so fully coherent and doesn't. Mormonism has evolved a lot in peripheral ways, but not a single one of those core 5 ideas has ever changed. And so I just find it a source of continual kind of amazement. Harold Bloom, who's a secular agnostic Jew, has said Joseph Smith had the greatest religious-making imagination of any American who ever lived. And so people might say, well, I'm biased if I were to say that, but that's a pretty good source for saying that.
I think you touched on this quite a bit in your lecture, but I'd just like to, now that we have you here, ask if you could elaborate a little bit more. What social, religious, political, or maybe geographical factors contributed to the inception of this new religion in the 19th century?
I did talk, a lot about, that's kind of the focus that I was trying to give to it, right, was this psychological dimension to anxiety about salvation and how do we find some kind of assurance. So I think that's the best explanation I've come up with, at least for the inception of Mormonism. In terms of the subsequent development of Mormonism, the most interesting fact would be that Mormonism then develops in total isolation from the rest of the American mainstream, right? Until the Transcontinental Railroad comes through in 1869. So you've got those pivotal decades, 46 to 69, where they're like the Amish, right? They're so completely insulated. And if you even look at their temples, think about the Utah temples. What do they look like, the first three temples? St. George and Manti and Salt Lake. They look like medieval fortresses, right? So there's this whole kind of mentality, this we're going to protect ourselves in these mountains. We will no longer be vulnerable to persecution or the whims of despotic, tyrannical mobs and governments. And so I think that has a formative shaping influence on Mormon insularity that only now, at the present moment, is the Mormon Church working vigorously to overturn by working on a history that is fully transparent, by trying to write history that is much more honest, stories of the brethren leaders that are not the hagiographies of the past. So I think those are two really important cultural things.
So if I could just give you a compliment for a minute. I think your work, if I don't mind, or if you don't mind, I think that what it does really well is it puts Mormonism into context. And for a long period of time, because of what you just stated, because of the isolation, because of a lack of connectedness, I don't think that Mormonism's been able to allow for a history that integrates and provides a lot of context. So the next question that I'd like to pose is, how has your study of literature informed your study of religion and theology?
Well, I think, so I can answer both the question I didn't address earlier, and I'll address this one too. One of the seminal moments in my intellectual formation, I think, was a brilliant insight of my wife, Fiona, who comes from a Catholic past. And she's reading in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 12, which is a story of the woman who flees into the wilderness under threat by the dragon. Protestantism has a very, very long history of reading this as an allegory of the so-called apostasy, or the turning away from the truth of the Catholic Church. But what Fiona noticed was that in the words of John the Revelator, in Revelation chapter 12, the woman flees into the wilderness where she is nurtured of the Lord. Meaning that during that period when the church is underground, so to speak, it is still in his care and keeping, and there is still a font of inspiration, revelation, something happening, transpiring. And so I think the fact that I come from a background in comparative literature, I was already open to a wealth, right, of just beautiful ideas written about by any number of poets and novelists and writers throughout the past. And so what that understanding of Revelation does for any person invested in Mormonism is to suggest that there needs to be a much more culturally rich way of contextualizing and thinking about Mormons. Mormons tend to have this very narrow idea of revelation as vertical, literal revelation, right? To read a lot of Mormon histories, you'd think that Joseph Smith sat down and God dictated to him every day, and he wrote down what God told him to write down. Whereas Joseph Smith himself gives a very, very different accounting of how he received revelation as a prophet. And if you look at the Joseph Smith papers that the historical department are producing today, we can see that Joseph Smith worked, he revised, he reworded revelation. So there's this sense that he is open to other influences, to a richer cultural and theological environment that fed into his restorationist project. So as a historian, I'm convinced that Joseph Smith's self-understanding as a prophet was that he was largely responsible to assimilate ideas and truths dispersed broadly upon the earth, rather than just receive this kind of new, radical, out of a vacuum idea.
So the title of your most recent book, Wrestling the Angel, it denotes an inherent struggle, paradox, tension. What have you seen as the collective struggle within Mormonism throughout the 19th century and continuing into the modern day?
I think many, right? Because I wrote a book called People of Paradox, in which I say Mormons have struggled with a whole series of tensions that they've never fully been able to reconcile, right? Mormons are the most authoritarian religion, but they're also the most highly individualistic, right? Other theologians say you Mormons make a fetish out of agency and freedom and individualism. But at the same time, we have this structure that's more rigid than the Catholic Church, right? There are also tensions between this sense that Mormons, right, you frequently hear them say, I know the church is true, I know this, I know this. There's a rhetoric of certainty, but that's juxtaposed with the sense that, well, Mormons will be learning forever. There's this eternal progression to their future. So I think those are two of the tensions. But I think the most problematic tension, and we saw this during the Mitt Romney campaign, right, is, and I remember once overhearing a couple of Mormons, they were getting ready to plan an open house in a Mormon chapel, and there was an argument between them as to what the theme should be. And I think this typifies perfectly the status of the church. One group was saying, I think the theme should be, hi, we're Mormons, we're your neighbors, we're just like you. And the other was, hi, we're Mormons, boy, are we different. And I think Mormons haven't figured out in their own minds. Do they want to build that bridge and say, no, we're Christians, we're just like you? It kind of reminds me, I imagine in my own mind, that there must have been a time around 60 AD when if you'd walked across the Judean desert, you'd have passed a cave and you'd have heard voices. And if you'd looked inside, you'd have seen Peter and Paul in an argument. And Peter would be saying, Paul, they don't think we're Jews. And Paul says, maybe we need a new name. And I think Mormons are the same. Are they Christians? Have they taken Christians one step further?
Thank you very much. So it's my understanding that your book, the book I just referenced, is the first of 2 volumes. I'm curious to know if you would let us know what the title of the next volume might be, and also how did you separate the content, and where are you in the production of the second volume?
Yeah, I originally approached Oxford and asked if I could write a 3-volume history of Mormon theology, and they said, no, how about 1? And so we compromised with 2. So volume 1 is a history of deep theology, cosmic structures, human anthropology, and the divine. Volume 2 will be a history of Mormon practice. So the Foundations of Mormon Thought, the Foundations of Mormon Practice. And a simple way of thinking about what I'm trying to accomplish in volume 2 is to answer the question, do Mormons really think Mother Teresa needs to be rebaptized? And I taught a seminar in Mormon studies at BYU 2 summers ago, and that was the question that I had a group of young scholars wrestling with. Is that really what your theology is telling you? And if so, why? So that's one of the questions that I'm trying to answer in a rigorous theological way. How do you really justify that kind of doctrine? Because God can just look upon the heart. Why are ordinances necessary? And the second larger question I'm asking is the question that the Protestants really, really had to wrestle with, and that is, why do we need a church? Let me tell you why this is such a good question. The Catholic Church, it's very simple for the Catholics, right? You need a church because you need the sacraments. The sacraments are the channels of salvation. Salvation can only be administered through that vehicle. And the only people who have the authority to do that are the priests. There's no complication there. But once you break away from the Catholic Church as a Protestant reformer, you have to ask a different question, because clearly you no longer have access to the priesthood authority, and so you have to redefine the sacraments, which they do. So for a Protestant, a sacrament is not a channel of salvation, it is a sign of grace. But then some Protestants got to thinking, well, then if your relationship is what really matters, then we don't really need a church. And there's a great quotation I have from Abraham Lincoln, in which Abraham Lincoln says, well, that's why I never went to church. Because I was taught I had to have a personal relationship with Jesus, and I believed in Jesus, and so who needed a church? And so I'm trying to answer in theological language, what does Mormonism believe is the reason for a formal institutional church? So I'm about halfway through this one.
Thank you very much. What do you see as the most significant gap in the presentation of early Mormon history between the institutional LDS Church, some of the correlated materials, and what you've come across in your personal study and research of historical texts?
I think there's no question here. The greatest gap is between the way Joseph saw himself and the way that the historians have tried to portray him, all the way until we get to Rough Stone Rolling. Joseph Smith's personal writings are full of wonderful one-liners like, I am not a righteous man, right? I mean, that's quite a thing for a prophet and founder of a church. I'm not a righteous man. Don't think I'm a righteous man. On another occasion, he said, I don't have the same right vouchsafed to every other American. I have no right to express my opinion freely, because whenever I do, somebody is there with a pencil to write it down and say it came from a prophet. In other words, Joseph believed that the process of inspiration and revelation were uncertain, they could be fuzzy and foggy, And in the best of times, we have to work and work and work at getting a closer apprehension of exactly what it is that God wants of us. And then in section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants, there's a fantastically surprising revelation that comes out in verse 1 of section 124. And I like to think of it this way. Section 124, verse 1 is where the Lord tells why he chose Joseph Smith to be a prophet. And you can imagine Joseph hearing he's going to get this revelation and thinking, oh, what's it going to be? Is it because of my purity of heart or my nobility of soul? And then when section 124 comes, what does it say? That I might show what I can do with the weak things of the earth. So Joseph continually portrayed, he painted himself in those terms. And yet, right, the Mormon manuals, lesson materials have always painted him as this perfect, right, airbrushed, and that's a horrible, horrible misrepresentation.
Perfect. How do you approach writing about defining religious history, specifically Mormon history, when the overarching narrative is so difficult to divide into fact versus fiction and even mythology?
Well, this is the problem. I came here to study intellectual history at Cornell, and we learned very, very quickly that intellectual history is one of the very, very most challenging and difficult disciplines, because how do you trace the genesis of an idea? How do you know where somebody got an idea from, or how it transmits from generation to generation? So all we have to work with are texts. And my work as a Mormon theologian and historian has been greatly, greatly enhanced by the fact that the Joseph Smith papers have now made available the full and complete text of every single document that Joseph Smith ever wrote, translated, dictated, or inspired. And so we at least have that record from which we can compile a probable account of the evolution of Mormon thought. And I think that's the best we can do.
And just two more questions. What is your objective in pursuing the topics you do in relation to Mormon history and theology, and what do you hope to accomplish through your writings and your work?
I was most influenced by a German philosopher named Georg Gadamer, and what I loved about this philosopher was he said, as long as you only ask genuine questions, you'll always be okay. And a genuine question means a question that exposes you to risk. Usually we only ask questions if we think we know what the answer is going to be. And so I try to ask genuine questions in my scholarship. And what am I trying to accomplish? I'm just trying to find the answer to real questions that matter to me. And if I'm going to get paid by a university to write books and study my own questions, I'll keep doing it.
Great. We have one more question from the audience.
Oh, I did say that. I said it was Fiona's insight about the diffuse cultural richness of Christianity. Other than meeting Fiona.
Okay, so the question is this. You began the lecture talking about the disappearance of religions. Why has Mormon theology continued? So the way I would interpret that question is, I remember you talking about a number of other sects in the 19th century, particularly in upstate New York. Some of them were not successful, and yet Mormonism was. So what do you see about Mormonism and the theology that has allowed it to be successful?
Two sociologists of religion, Rodney Stark and I forget his first name, Block. They did a number of really fascinating studies in the 1980s, 90s on the subject of religious success. And the question they were asking was this very question: why do some religions thrive and others dwindle and perish? And the answers that they came up with were entirely counterintuitive. And they've revolutionized my thinking, and I think the thinking of a lot of religious scholars about what makes for a successful religion. Let me give you a quick anecdote. We were driving through Massachusetts not too long ago. We passed one of these beautiful little colonial clapboard churches, and they had a marquee out in front. And the marquee said, "Come worship with us. Soft pews, no hell." And my question is, what do you think the impact of that sign was on church attendance? And we know. I mean, I didn't ask the pastor, but based on statistical analyses of religious growth and religious failure among prominent Protestant denominations, we know that was exactly the wrong signal to send. What these sociologists concluded was, if you want to have a successful religious movement, it has to be high demand. It has to be high demand.
And the two highest demand religions right now are the two fastest growing religions in the world, by most people's estimates. And those would be Islam and Mormonism. What do you have? What does it take to be a good Muslim? You've got to pay a generous tithe, right? Free will offering. You've got to do the Hajj. Somehow you've got to find a way to make it to Mecca once in your lifetime. You've got to pray 5 times a day, regardless of how convenient it is. You have to fast 40 days in sequence during Ramadan. Yeah, just go and try that. What do you have to do to be a good faithful Mormon? You've got to pay 10% of your income. You've got to give 2 years of your life as a missionary. You've got to be a lay minister. You've got to keep chaste before marriage. You can't, right? The whole thing. So I think that's what distinguished Mormonism, is it was so difficult to subscribe to a list of expectations that it fosters a level of commitment that has long-range benefits for the durability of the faith.
Once again, I'd like to thank Terrell Givens, Wilson Ong, and also the Rockwell.